Good morning. Let's call the meeting to order. Do we have any public speakers, Mr. Morello?
Chairman, we have 7 speakers. We would remind our public comment guests that in the interest of treating all of our speakers equitably, you should keep your comments to our 2-minute limit. When you approach the point at which you have 30 seconds left, some machines should make a noise reminding you that it's time to wrap up. Our first speaker is Carol Raftery. She'll be followed by H.P. Schroer and then Vijay Dugal. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Carol Raftery. I'm here on behalf of Build Up New York City. Build Up New York City is an alliance of more than 200,000 hardworking men and women in construction and building service industries. We work to grow and improve the middle class throughout New York City, including Long Island City and Astoria, by promoting good, safe jobs for workers and their families. In January, we told the MTA about Court Square City View Tower, a 67-story construction going up at 2315 44th Drive in Long Island City. We told you the reasons we think the project deserves special scrutiny, especially the potential it has to disrupt the commute of thousands of subway riders. I came before you again last month to give you more information about the project. Now we have learned that the New York City Environmental Control Board has set a hearing on April 10th to look into the failure to provide site-specific plans, details, and sequences of construction and underpinning and related work. Chairman Leota, we have not heard or seen anything being done about this project. As we've requested, does the MTA have a plan to look into this project? Has the MTA seen the plans for the tower or site preparations that got underway in December 2017? Has the MTA considered whether the tower is feasible at this location? Have the MTA engineers and other technical staff examined the plans and reviewed what impact the construction will have on the elevated track of the number 7 line, Court Square subway station, and the E, G, and M subway lines underground while the tower is being built? Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. H.P. Schroer, then Vijay Dugal, then Mary Parison. I'm sorry, Mr. Schroer, just 1 second. Just 1 second, please. I'm sorry. A reminder to our speakers that if you require or prefer a portable mic, get the attention of one of our staff and we'll bring it to you. Thanks, Mr. Schroer.
I want to thank the board for its dedication in coming out on a day like this. For the record, my name is H.P. Schroer, a veteran of World War II. Obviously, I was disappointed to receive Douglas Johnson's letter of February 26, in which he advised me it was not financially feasible to afford giving a reduced fare to veterans at this time. When will it be the right time? It should be noted that veterans never, I repeat, never received a discount in over 100 years. Do we have to wait another 100? Or will the mayor and the governor support congestive pricing and make it possible now? A few months ago, I submitted an estimate of what it would cost to fund a veterans discount for veterans of any age and their spouses. The figures were an estimate I made from a 2016 American Community Survey of Veteran Status. In view of the financial condition of the MTA, I have now limited the area to New York City and to veterans and not spouses. The annual cost would be estimated for the 21,800 veterans would be around $15,260,000. If you were to dedicate a penny from every fare collected, it would provide enough funds to give a veteran's discount.
You should wrap up, Mr. Schroer.
For 2 cents, you could include the spouses. Are the sacrifices made by veterans and their spouses worth 2 cents? I'll leave it to the governor and the mayor and this committee to explain to the public why you all say no. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Schroer. Vijay Dugal, Mary Parison, then Colin Wright. Good morning.
Morning. My name is Vijay Dugal. I had requested a handout to be placed of all the board members, and it's titled "The Image of the City." If you look, and the Safer New York. And for the distinguished guests and other members, I would like to share this letter and this proposal with you through this website. I would like to share with the gentlemen, let me repeat, start over. I had requested a handout to be placed in everybody's desk, all the board members and other leadership. And this is a letter titled "The Image of the City and a Safer New York." It describes how we can improve the outlook of tracks and the safety of the tracks. The main problem we encounter with maintaining these tracks is that the water gets mixed up with trash and it's very difficult to pick up. So this proposal is about installing a very fancy deck cover to cover these trench drains. And this deck cover is also embedded with the intrusion detection sensor. So it's a safety plus the cleanliness. It will make it very, very easy for the trash to be picked up because it will never mix up with water. So the main problem, the image of the city, we have like an open trench drain in the middle of the tracks. No matter how much effort MT has put up, it still remains quite dirty, very difficult to maintain. So this proposal will make it very, very easy to maintain and reduce the rodent problems.
You should wrap up, Mr. Dugal.
And there's a
Thank you.
website for everybody else too. You can look up www.innotect.net. That has this letter and this proposal. Innotect.net. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dugal. As you may have seen, the board members are looking at the materials right now. Thank you. Mary Parison, Colin Wright, and then Haley Richardson. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Mary Parison Lavelle, and I'm the chair of Civics United for Railroad Environmental Solutions. CURES was formed back in 2009, and our number one priority was to upgrade and replace the 11 antiquated locomotives being used by New York and Atlantic. For public health reasons, the New York State legislator and the governor have made it a priority to replace them with Tier 4 locomotives and have appropriated $3 million per year since 2013. So let's do the math. That's $18 million. In the tainted procurement of 2013 to 2016, the MTA LIRR spent $4.3 million on 2 locomotives. So why does the Long Island Railroad's 2018 procurement only bidding out for 2 locomotives? Things don't add up. This procurement should be for at least 4 or 5 Tier 4 switch-duty cycle locomotives, the cleanest for our communities. To add salt to the wound, and against all reason, we recently learned that in 2017, the Long Island Railroad sold New York and Atlantic 3 of those antiquated locomotives for which the MTA, Long Island Railroad, already had replacement funding from the governor and legislature. In doing this, some Long Island Railroad personnel did not adhere to state policy or exercise discretion in the public interest and the financial interest of the MTA. Instead, Long Island Railroad sold these locomotives to New York and Atlantic Railway, a private company that is being sued for horrific, alleged labor abuses and investigated by several state and federal agencies. Who made this idiotic decision to sell these locomotives and
You'll have to wrap up, Ms. Parison.
millions of dollars from the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust Fund? We ask the MTA Board to refer this matter to the MTA Office of Inspector General. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colin Wright, Haley Richardson, and then Tabitha Decker. Good morning.
Morning. I'm Colin Wright with Transit Center's Access Denied campaign. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York recently joined one of several lawsuits against the MTA, claiming it violated the Americans with Disabilities Act for failing to include elevators in the Middletown Road section renovation in the Bronx. In light of this action, and before you approve of more renovation contracts, ask yourself, do each of our renovations comply with the ADA? The answer is no, and this fact is morally wrong, illegal, and exposes the MTA to and New York's taxpayers to further litigation. The facts in the Middletown Road case were clear and egregious, but not unique. The federal government repeatedly warned the MTA that failing to include elevators in the renovation would result in non-compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Neither cost nor infeasibility were valid or legal excuses. Rather than following the letter or the spirit of the ADA, the MTA stonewalled, refusing to provide technical documentation and repeatedly changing its justification for not complying. This doesn't end at Middletown Road. You're renovating or plan to renovate dozens of stations without adding elevators. These include Ditmars Boulevard, the 163rd Street station, and Broadway Junction, just to name a few recent examples. Riders agree with the U.S. Attorney. Undergoing major station renovations without adding ADA accessibility is wrong and illegal. Surely the U.S. Attorney chose to join this suit after witnessing hundreds of disabled riders, seniors, and others saying no more. Indeed, the only people who think the MTA is complying with the ADA is your leadership. Show riders a plan for system-wide station accessibility and stop renovating stations without adding ADA access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Haley Richardson, and then finally Tabitha Decker. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Haley Richardson, also with Transit Center's Access Denied campaign. This week, Google Maps released a feature that allows public transit users to plan wheelchair-accessible trips. This is an excellent development and happened despite the fact that the MTA has not yet made public the GTFS data that contains the list of accessible stations. However, Google's trip planner is far from complete because it lacks the ability to tap into real-time elevator outage info. Given the scarcity of elevators within the New York City subway system and the high rates of outages, one unexpected out-of-service elevator imposes an enormous time penalty on riders by forcing them to dramatically reroute their trips. We encourage the MTA to develop an application programming interface that would allow third-party apps to access this essential real-time elevator outage data. This is a simple step well within the technical prowess of MTA engineers, who would go a long way towards sending the message that the agency cares about the needs of its riders. But in order for this to work, the agency should also make every effort to ensure that outage data is reported in a timely and accurate manner on the MTA's own elevator and escalator status website. Since we're on the topic of elevators, several of you are nearing the end of your term as board members. When you're in touch with the electeds who appointed you, you should encourage them to put someone on the board who is a wheelchair user, so that decisions about station design, prioritization, and fundamentally about who gets to move freely around New York City don't continue to take place without the input of the people being affected. As the MTA wraps up its key station agreement and begins thinking about its next round of accessibility improvements, there's no better time to start seeing things through the perspective of a rider who can't use stairs, and no better way to accomplish that than having this rider be one of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tabitha Decker. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Tabitha Decker from Transit Center here on behalf of the Bus Turnaround Coalition. The Bus Turnaround Coalition commends New York City Transit for giving riders the ability to track bus speeds and reliability with its new dashboard. The dashboard reports on what matters to riders: time at bus stops, travel time, and bus speeds. Riders can now find this information easily, a notable leap forward from the days of searching through board packets and deciphering what one could from metrics like weight assessment. The new bus dashboard could be even more useful for riders. Route-level analysis should be added. If a rider of the BX19 wants to know how her route is doing, she can't find that information in the current dashboard. Second, this analysis should be linked to the agency's goals for improving buses, using these metrics to evaluate progress and determine what solutions are proving most effective. Increasingly slow and unreliable bus service is costing riders time and opportunity every single day, and New York City bus riders are eagerly awaiting the forthcoming bus action plan. They deserve action that matches the magnitude and urgency of the problem. The redesign of Staten Island Express buses that's underway right now is precisely the type of reform that's needed to achieve quick and dependable bus trips. We strongly support that effort and applaud New York City Transit President Andy Byford's commitment to providing the same type of upgrade to riders throughout the 5 boroughs. Another ambitious solution that should be part of the plan is all-door boarding system-wide when the MetroCard is replaced. When combined with collaboration with the New York City DOT and other elements of city government to give buses unobstructed priority on city streets, these measures provide a clear path for reform and a clear turnaround for New York City's buses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the public comment for today.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin today's meeting with a moment of silence for New York City track worker St. Clair Zaire Richards Stevens. Mr. Richard Stevens, as you all know, died yesterday on the job after falling from an elevated track area at 125th Street. So if we can have a moment of silence. Thank you. As we learn more in the coming days about this tragedy and the causes of this tragedy, we will keep you informed. In the meantime, on behalf of the entire organization, I want to offer our deepest condolences to his family, his friends, and all of his co-workers. Now, a brief update on the storm. I want to thank all of the board members for showing up this morning. And I would also, for the public who's watching, I'd like to encourage everyone to stay up to date with all of our service updates by visiting www.mta.info. You'll find updated information, doesn't matter what form of or mode of travel you're using, subways, buses, the Long Island Railroad, Metro North, including what is happening regarding traffic on the MTA bridges and tunnels. I would like to give a shout out to the work that's being done by all of our employees. We've been planning on this for the last 48 hours. It's been a massive effort underway, and hopefully all of our passengers and all of our customers will be able to see it. Next, we have 4 brief presentations from the working groups that were created in December. These groups were formed to take a new look and an intense look at areas of a persistent challenge for us here. Today, each group's chair, who is a member of the board, will report to the board with new approaches to improve service or efficiency in those areas. We'll hear from Scott Reckler regarding Construction Cost Working Group, Chuck Merdler, who is the chair of the Procurement Reform Working Group, Veronica Vanderpool, who is the chair of the Paratransit Assessor Ride Working Group, and Ira Greenberg, who is the chair of the Subway Accessibility Working Group. Neil Zuckerman, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, who's leading the Railroad Subcommittee focused on the implementation of positive train control, will provide his update at a future board meeting. With that, let me turn the floor over to Scott for our first presentation. Scott?
Thank you, Chairman Loda. So we've had a series of meetings with Jano Lieber taking the lead and the staff working with us. And I think when we started this process, I made the point that clearly there was concerns that our construction and procurement process was broken and needed to be fixed. I think as we've dug into it, I think it's more than broken. I think and fixing requires a little bit more than just peeling back the onion. It really is something that, as we've looked at it, it means really ripping up what we had and starting over again. And the key areas of as you focus on this is just starting with our analysis of what the cost is and establishing the original budget for the cost, the change order process, the procurement process, and then ultimately the implementation oversight of this. And so we have actually have already begun starting to make some of these implementations of the changes, but it's going to be a major process to do it. It's not something that's going to happen overnight if it's going to be fixed more permanently, and it's also going to require a change of culture at the MTA and maybe change of personnel and bringing in new personnel and change of organizational design. To be specific on the cost estimating as the first example, I think one thing that we've all seen is that there's been estimates that have been provided to the board and the public very early in the process, when in reality it's almost impossible to really know what the cost of a project is until you've actually got the plans done to a level where you can go out for a bid and get some feedback. And I think part of the process that we're focused on is not actually guiding the staff to not actually come out with a exact budget number, but what an estimate is. And then when they've actually got a set of plans and a scope that they've gotten feedback from the marketplace, coming back to the board and the public, and then establishing a well thought out budget along the way. And I think what's key about that is if you understand what the real costs are going into a project, it gives you the chance to take a step back and value engineer if it's too high a cost or change the scope of the project versus putting out a number and assuming we're going to be there. And I think if you look, for example, that we're all experiencing at East Side Access, I'm not sure there ever was a real number that anyone understood what that cost was going to be. And so when we're talking about all these cost overruns, some of it's cost overruns, some of it is the real cost that would have always been there had we known what that would have been, and maybe we wouldn't have gone forward with the project in the current state if we had the benefit of that transparency from the beginning. So I think that's the first area of the recommendation. The second is in the design process, which what we've seen one of the challenges is that each group within the agency has the ability to offer their objectives for that design, and they seek customization themselves. And so what you have is, everyone's wish list is put into every project's design, which increases the scope of the project. And there's not any one particular engineer who's responsible in totality to say what should be accepted and what's not accepted in that design. So one area that we're looking for is to actually create an owner and a senior engineer that's charged with doing the final value engineering and determining what is really needed in terms of those requests and what is not needed, and then leading the value engineering process along the way. Procurement, which Commissioner Murdo is going to speak more about shortly, and I'm sure more eloquently than I'm going through this process, as he typically does, is clearly a mess. And you'll see it. I think one of the things that is as a starting point to make procurement work, we really need to rip up our existing contracts that over the years and decades have had layers and layers and layers of checks and balances put in place and start from scratch. If we were going to actually go out and think about what a contract will look like today and compare what the MTA has as its initial contract, it would never look this way. And I think you have to have the right checks and balances, but we've, I think, gotten where we're more focused on protecting ourselves from risks versus actually having something that's manageable. And the byproduct of that is, as we've all heard, and we saw even in our discussion at our committee meetings, we have fewer and fewer contractors that are willing to actually bid on our projects, and the ones that do bid on our project put in a 10 to 20% premium simply because they know they have to navigate a very difficult procurement process along the way. And so I think starting from scratch, we actually asked Jano and the working group to actually work with council and said, if you were going to put together a brand new contract, what would it look like? Don't try to amend what we have. Start from scratch and tell us what you think it would look like if we were having a brand new contract along the way. And the fourth area is change orders, which is something that we've all recognized and heard stories about how difficult it is, but it can take 9 months to get a change order approved on an active project. And so one thing that we've talked about is reevaluating the organizational design of a project. And typically in the construction business of mega projects, you actually have a project executive or a CEO of that project that is charged with being on site and being able to determine which change orders make sense and which ones don't make sense, and giving immediate response to that. And I think, between having someone there in that accountable for making those decisions and dealing with the incoming request from the specific agencies within the MTA who have their own goals along the way, let that CEO or project executive be the arbiter as to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that decision stands. And I think our view is, if that decision wants to be appealed, it should go all the way up to the chairman so that there's clear accountability to break through the silos that exist with this agency. And I think, that change in structure alone, I think will go a long way because it will create, an accountable person that when we're all said and done is going to be responsible for bringing in this project on time and on budget. And if not, we'll know who that one person is. Right now, there's so many different players and stakeholders along the way, you can't hold anyone accountable. So it's really those four areas that I think need to be focused on, but it's going to require, as I said, a rewrite of our contracts, a rewrite of our organizational structure, a rewrite of our policies, and a change in how our culture, where we actually have someone that we entrust to be accountable to make the decisions without having to go through the whole bureaucracy that could take 9 months and ultimately on just and change orders and ultimately lead to a tremendous amount of waste. And then, the transparency, obviously, of understanding the scope of the project and the value engineering that's required. So we have more work to do. We actually have another meeting this afternoon that we're reconvening, and actually with the Chairman, Commissioner Merdler's group on procurement, so that we can share our ideas and make sure that we're working together. But I think that we've identified the critical elements that need to be chopped away, and I look forward to keep moving forward.
Before we move on, are there any questions of Commissioner Murr? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate Mr. Reckler's hard work on this and that of his working group. Is there anything written on these very thoughtful recommendations?
So
there is, and we're actually, this afternoon, we're going to be reviewing it in the joint working group, and then we can distribute it to the full board subsequent to that.
Thank you.
I wanted all the members of the board and the public to understand that the creation of these working groups were real, and that this is just an interim reporting process. So, that's why I wanted to keep it as short as possible this morning. Yes, Commissioner Albert.
Scott, is one of the goals of your working group to try to open up the procurement process to more potential bidders and thus more competitive bids for us?
Exactly. So again, when you go and look at the existing contracts and the procurement process, and as I said, Commissioner Murther will speak more about this, it's so cumbersome, and even the change order process is so cumbersome, that if you're a contractor bidding, you need to either decide, do I really want to go through this, or you're going to build in a gigantic cushion, which immediately increases the pricing. So that is a key element of it. And I will just add, the process itself is frustrating to the MTA teams, on the ground. If they know what's right, they know if a change order should be done or not done, and if they have to go through a 9-month bureaucratic process, it's not fair for our own teams to not have a streamlined approach where they can be thinking about how they're going to maximize the dollars that we're investing on behalf of the public for the project. So I think that's critical.
Thank
also.
You. Thank you.
Further questions? Commissioner Merdler.
Mr. Chairman, the procurement working group consists of Mr. Weisberg, Ms. Vanderpool, led by staff through Pat Foy, and with the invaluable assistance of Stephen Plukchucky, who has really made possible some very startling progress. Our task is to examine how you bid, buy, measure the qualifications of bidders, encourage honest competition, and open the process for competition. We started with the procedural aspect because vendors and those who do business with the MTA consistently complain that the process takes too long and is too complicated. Even the agencies that use the process wind up extending existing contracts rather than having to go through the whole process all over again. First, let me give you the bottom line. The procurement process at transit, which has been our focus, can be shortened by 2/3, reducing from 278 days, or some 9.5 months, to 113 days, or 3.5 months, the time it takes in awarding the average operating service contract. That is from the determination to initiating procurement to making the actual award and start fashioning the contract. The better news is this is now being implemented to the extent legally possible, and I'll explain that, by transit. The process is underway. 2/3 of the time will be cut off as soon as we get it all in place. The hope is to take that over next to the operating agencies, the railroads, and MTA construction. This change should not only significantly reduce delays and costs, but it will make competition possible by making it easier for prospective vendors to navigate the process in a less bureaucratic fashion. Changes in statute and regulations will be required, but more importantly, cultural changes and cooperation are necessary. Let me give you a couple of examples why the process has been as lengthy, 9.5 months to get an ordinary, uncomplicated, basic procurement through the system. This entire process has been started first in a privately operated transit system decades ago. Then it was the city of New York that took it over and struggled, as we do, with it, and then MTA. And in the course of that, one layer of rules, normally resulting from the fact that there has been a crisis, there's been a scandal, there's been a problem, there's been something, has been put on top of the other. Let me give you an example so you can see how this has really gotten bad, but is about to change, and indeed has started to change. Over the years, they developed a psychology that you had to have somebody or somebodies responsible for following to make sure the procurement was in order. Not a bad idea. But it became a requirement as it built up. First, you had to have the signature on the procurement that went to the board. Look at all of your procurements. You'll see it in the staff summary, all those initials. You had to have the president of the agency. You had to have the counsel from the agency. You had to have the auditor. You had to have my Aunt Tilly. Everybody had to initial it, all right? Now, it had to go from point A to across the hall in point B and down the block to point C to collect all these signatures. Believe it or not, a total of 40 days, I repeat, 40 days was devoted to that mechanical process of getting people to initial and sign. Starting now, it's 6 days. That stuff has got to change, and we're going to try and make it do so. Now, what we have done also affects how you encourage people to participate in the process. To ensure that competition is encouraged and the opportunity to bid is widely publicized by law, as well as by grafted-on procedures, you now have to publish an advertisement in the state contractor reporter. You have to publish it in a newspaper. Currently, it's either the New York Post or El Diario. And a total of 43 days was allocated for that process. Why? Because between the time you crafted the procurement, then put the ad together, then got it over to the newspaper, and it then found time and space to publish it, weeks went by. Those 43 days are going to be gone. The governor has included in the budget message the beginning of that process, and we are going to secure the process to be down to hopefully 10 days, period, and then try and reduce it even more. How? Online. We're in the internet stage. We're in an era where people get instant communication. Why do you have to go through all this nonsense? Lastly, let me consider one more piece, because it's important for encouraging people to come in and compete. Time and again, I have heard, and every member of this board has heard, from those who are entering the field, especially minority vendors, that the insurance and bonding requirements are crippling to their ability to come in and do it. We have started to work on that, and first thing we did was take a good look at how on earth can you cut down the time frame. Why? Let me show you the time frame. In transit, and Steve Plukchucky, who has done absolutely yeoman work on this, has been digging into this for a while. You have, for every single low bid, you have to have a customized insurance form. Each one's, but in the industry, there is a standard form. It has been a standard form for decades throughout the entire industry. Welcome to the new century and to a new era. We are going to move toward adopting the standard industry forms so that we can get it done. We're by no means finished, because we now have to turn to other aspects of this process. There are tens of thousands of forms that people file. The blizzard outside doesn't equal the amount of forms that exist in the various agencies of government. All right? We're going to reduce them. You don't need them. Again, we're in the internet age. Things can be done quickly, and they should be. And so we're going to move into that. And indeed, Stephen has started on that process. We're going to pre-qualify bidders, so we have them ready, willing, and able and qualified even before various procurements are issued, so that the process can move quickly and people can get their jobs, they can make a living, and we can get things done. We're going to make further changes in bonding and insurance. We're going to take steps to make this process workable. And that's what you instructed, Mr. Chairman, and that's what the governor directed, and we're on our way.
Thank you, Chuck. Let me start off by thanking you, but I also want to talk about the fact that everything to date that you've done has been at the Transit Authority. When looking at Kathy and Pat and Cedric in the back, we do need to do this at the railroads as well as bridges and tunnels, as well as in corporate, so that we can find a very efficient and more efficient way to get things done. And one of the questions earlier was about competition. Yes, but I think when I'm putting the working groups together and waiting till after these first two presentations, I wanted to say, I have a button on my desk that says, this is the way we've always done it, with a line slashed through it. I mean, those days have got to come to an end. We've got to start doing things in a more 21st century way. So I want to thank both you and Scott for the work that you're doing, because when you both talk about changing culture, I think that's a critical part of this. I think there's more than enough work for everybody here. This is not about people losing their jobs. It may be about people changing their jobs, but changing them for the better, doing more and doing it for less. Any questions? None. Commissioner Vanderpool, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. We have heard loud and clear that access-to-ride and paratransit needs an overhaul, and that change is underway. And I'm happy to report that before the task force even began, and we began in December, as many of the other task forces did as well, a lot of that change was already underway. And I want to specifically acknowledge the advocates and the customers of the system for taking the time to come to the monthly board meetings to talk about their very challenging situations, using that same system to get here that they have experienced challenges with. It was not an easy thing, and that effort and that time is certainly appreciated because it's informing our process. I also want to acknowledge the team at the MTA that's been working on this, and that team is President Irick, Mike Cosgrove, and many other people that many of the public do not interface with but are working really hard. For every story that is shared with us about access-to-ride transit, there's a human person, there's a real life story and anecdote behind that. And I want to assure you that there's a real person who is behind the scenes taking that information and doing something with it. So there is a connection there. So I also want to thank board members Ira Greenberg, who, as you all have heard, is chairing the Accessibility Task Force. There's a good deal of intersection and discussion between us on these issues. And some other board members, such as Randy Glucksman, Commissioner Glucksman, and Commissioner Jones, have also weighed in. And again, whether or not a member is part of any given task force, these are issues that we all care about and will be advancing moving forward. So I want to just highlight a few things. Our goal for this task force is to accelerate key projects and initiatives. And we have focused on 6 areas. Those 6 areas are safety, reliability, modernity, convenience, ease, and communications. And I want to share with you some of the highlights, and I've grouped them into a few categories. There have been quite a good number of highlights to share with you. So the first way I want to group them is around better communication. Many of you know that an access-to-ride dashboard was recently launched. It includes statistics such as on-time performance, no-shows. The value of this is not only does this dashboard put data in the agency's hands for us to examine, it puts the data in the public's hands for you to examine also. That internal and external advocacy is incredibly important to the evolution of the work that we're doing. And I'm a big advocate for having data in the public realm. So I'm excited to see this dashboard. It's an iterative dashboard. Feedback is constantly being received, and it's my understanding that feedback is being received from members of the public and, of course, from the MTA team quite often. There's a new website, and the website includes features such as where's my vehicle? So you can track your vehicle if you've requested a vehicle, and you can manage your trip. Now, that sounds so commonplace to all of us, but for access-to-ride and paratransit users, that functionality has not yet been enabled and has led to a very frustrating experience because so much control is out of the customer's hands. But with this new website and some other apps, which I'm going to touch on in a moment, we've been trying to give more control to the customer over his or her trip. So there's a new app that's in development. It's the My Access-a-Ride app, and on March 1st, there was a very unique forum open to the public in the same vein as hackathons, where the members of the public are invited to review the development of a software app. This was in the same context. About 30 members of the public, both from the advocacy community and users of the system, participated, and that number was complemented by agency staff and leadership who were present for several hours on a Wednesday evening to interface and engage with users of the system and understand what would make this app a much better app. And again, that's a unique opportunity or a unique a forum that hadn't necessarily happened before. So I want to really shout out the team for doing that. And I want to shout out the people who took the time in the evening to share their feedback. With regards to better communication, we are working with different civic and external partners. There's been a lot of progress over the years, or a lot of work being done over the years on access-to-ride and paratransit, but that has not been effectively communicated with the public. So rightfully so, the public comes to these meetings not understanding a lot of the work that's happening behind the scenes. And a lot of the discussions that we've been having in our task force is how to better communicate the work that you're doing. We have to understand the public is going to be upset if they don't know that these developments and initiatives are underway. And it's not fair to the staff that's working on it, and it's certainly not fair to the public who doesn't know that these things are in development. So we're really trying to improve that in this communication section. And part of that is developing a strategic plan. Paratransit needs a strategic plan that is multi-year. So we're in the process of discussing what that would look like. The next category would be better technology and how we're improving technology for our customers. Vehicles, our brokers now have GPS. So we can better track these vehicles. Again, things that we've taken for granted in our daily commutes, but for the paratransit user has been something that has not been accessible or available to them. Having the ability for us to track their broker and better communicate where their broker is in the trip is a huge change. We launched an e-hail pilot in October, which is very popular. It gives the user can download an app and then track where their vehicle is. They have more control over their trip. Again, groundbreaking, something that hadn't existed before. There's new software that enables live booking or live confirmation of a booking. So customers and users were scheduling a trip, but weren't finding out if their trip was confirmed immediately. Sometimes it would take about 24 hours to know if that trip was confirmed. Now there is new software that enables that immediately. And again, that's a game changer. And then that same software is improving the ETA information. So that way we can better say to our customers, we know when your vehicle is going to arrive. We have a much better sense because we have better software and technology that we're employing. That is one of the biggest complaints and criticisms that we've heard from our users, that they call to find out the status of their vehicle, and they're not given, in their opinion, the most accurate view. So this is one step in improving that. And then lastly, under better technology, we're looking at ways of improving fare payment technology for our users in the system on the vehicles. Much like our entire MTA system is retiring the MetroCard, and we have new technology underway, we're looking to see how we can bring that into paratransit. And then the last category I just want to touch upon, we're looking at new safety metrics, how to also train differently, new training modules, including the use of technology for drivers and having a policy around that. And then lastly, there is a Bill of Rights that was finalized, and that is now available on the website. Oh, and lastly, there's an improved application. So the application for eligibility for Access-a-Ride has been streamlined. So it makes it a less onerous process for someone who needs the service. And these are the sorts of things that may have been overlooked for some time, but that these changes make a significant difference in the experience of our customer, but then also in the product and the service that we provide. So I want to thank everyone, and I've been directing the audience because I think it's important. You all have been here communicating this, so these comments are for you all. And thanks to my colleagues and the chairman for the support of this. And actually Chairman Schwartz, who suggested that these task forces be created. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Are there any questions for her? Veronica, one of the things I'd like to work with you on is our ability to market so many of our apps that are up there and out there, as well as using members from the disabled community to help with the communications, because some of them who started to use these apps, Gene Rushinoff in particular, is ecstatic about how much better it is. So we need to be able to use that, because we as an organization, we don't do a great job in marketing. So let's see what we can do to help that. Thanks. Ira, report on accessibility.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The working group on accessibility is chaired by me, and I want to first thank my fellow board members, Randy Glucksman, David Jones, Veronica Vanderbilt, and Carl Weisbrod for working with us, as well as Ronnie Hakem, who's really been the staff heading it up, and of course Transit President Andy Byford, who's really been in the meeting and pushing things ahead much more than I would have ever expected. He's been, as someone says, stuck his chin out there on this issue, and I'm standing behind him yelling, "Go, charge!" The group started by becoming better informed of New York City Transit's existing program on accessibility, including reviewing the criteria that are used to support the initial rounds of station selection, the 100 stations, and right now, actually, we have over 100 stations, 118 accessible stations now. Another 25 are underway through the capital program. As I mentioned, Andy Byford's made this one of his priorities. This is 4 pillars, and I applaud him for that. The working group is working on 3 main objectives, although we're expanding. On capital improvements, our goal is to make as many stations as accessible as possible and as soon as possible. Having said that, there obviously are challenges, and we're seeking the development of additional accessibility projects in this and the next capital program. The current capital program, before we got started, had $10 million in it for a study to look at every single station that was not accessible and see how to make it accessible. So that was already before. That contract went to Stantec Engineering late last year, and now I'm happy to say they're on their way to assessing all the remaining stations. This year there'll be at least 150. Andy wants to push for more. God bless him. And by the end of 2019, all stations will be assessed for this. I'm hoping this will inform the next capital program and the 20-year needs assessment. The working group is reviewing the criteria, which I mentioned before, to choose stations to best leverage our capital monies. We plan to apply criteria such as addressing accessibility deserts and where can we benefit communities that have higher concentrations of disabled people. I think as moving forward, we're going to look at our criteria, because I think what we want to do is make the whole system as accessible as possible, as soon as possible, which means that we want a distribution. There's places that are accessibility deserts, I call them, and I think we're going to at this time in place when we look at the next capital program. I think we want to try to address that. Also, we're going to try to leverage development anywhere where there's development of in Manhattan, especially. We're going to say, can we get an elevator there or some level of accessibility there? Take advantage of any development, almost anywhere in the city, Long Island City, as well. That won't preclude us from saying just because there's going to be development at a station, that doesn't mean we don't want to make that station accessible. We're not going to wait. I don't think our policy is to wait for some, because there's been upzoning or because there's potential for that, to wait for that to happen. I just want people to understand that. Transit is undertaking a review of elevator specifications to determine if they're appropriately scoped, non-customized, maintainable, and cost-efficient. The idea is to contain these costs and so that projects can be more efficient and we could have do more with our money, because right now sometimes we do these projects and they're almost custom to each station. If we could get a cookie cutter, so to speak, elevator, or even cookie cutter design for several stations, we would save costs and be able to do more with less. On communications, Transit is now reviewing its website, putting together a resource guide of available information and sources for support for the transit system. In addition, Transit has set a goal to improve the real-time elevator status information and to look for additional sources to distribute information about accessibility in the system through the use of on-the-go kiosks, digital displays in stations, subway cars, and buses, and improved training for platform and customer service staff, including bus drivers. We've heard some complaints about that, and I'm happy to say, actually, I spoke with Daryl Eric, and he's on it right now. I was going to say that should be as our next few meetings, but Daryl's stepped in. He's going to take a look at the training for bus drivers, because we've received complaints about them not knowing how to use lifts because of the intermittent use of it, so he's going to try to look that depot to depot and address that. On maintenance operations, to improve the reliability of existing elevators, Transit has retained a consultant to review Transit's maintenance, repair, and inspection practices with the expectation of being able to improve procedures and the deployment of resources. We all have seen the new maintenance contracts for elevators and efforts to hire and retain our maintainers. Those contracts would not have been possible without the cooperation of the TWU, so I want to thank them and the employees who are staying with us, because we often lose a lot, and for all of them for the cooperation and this effort. I hope in the future we'll plan on taking a look at the commuter railroads in the next quarter, as well as continuing to work on these objectives and future updates. As a postscript, along with Commissioner Vanderpool and I, we've been trying to work together as the community here is both. We've met with a number of people in the community. I think we want to continue to do that, to keep them updated and get their input. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. Are there any questions for Ira? Yes, Commissioner Albert.
Ira, this is really good stuff, and President Byford is a great asset. And one of the most exciting things I think President Byford has announced is that he's looking at a new, smaller type of elevator, which may fit in stations that previously could not accommodate our standard elevator, which I think could be a real turning point for making more stations accessible. Are you also looking at legal challenges when a station might abut a co-op or a condo, and the positioning of an elevator might be something that the co-op or condo board has a problem with, and there's no other place to put an elevator, and I'm of course referring to stations such as the group along Central Park West?
Well, we've discussed those issues. I mean, I think trying to work with the community or work with the particular property owner is something to do. It's interesting you mentioned this, because I had a conversation with Ronnie about this, about, how do you make a station accessible in situations where the station's right up against the buildings, you drop an elevator down, and then you wind up blocking the sidewalk or having very little space in the sidewalk. And I think we're going to look at the study and see where that comes up, and I think we're going to have to engage. We're going to certainly engage. The city is very engaged. I know Commissioner Calise. We've met with him. They're very engaged with this and very committed to it. There may be issues with coming out into the block, maybe taking a portion of a lane of traffic away because of those types of issues, or working with people. I think that's what we're going to have to do. As far as the sidewalk, the city controls the sidewalk. The co-op, the condo, or the building owner, whoever it is, may have an objection to it, and we'd like to work with them. But I think we have to give, accessibility a priority. I know I've seen some controversies in the paper about this, but we have to, when the rubber meets the road, we want to make the station accessible. We don't want to make the sidewalk less accessible.
Yes.
But we have to do that. And I think that's where we'd be headed with that.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, Scott.
First, actually, in my enthusiasm, I forgot to thank my fellow commissioners, Commissioner Schwartz, Trottenberg, and Mitch Paley for the work on the panel with. I apologize. But just two other points I wanted to note that I neglected. One is we've also been reaching out to the contractors to get their feedback. So not only are we trying to get internal feedback, but external feedback and members of labor to get their feedback. And so we're trying to do sort of a 360 review and try not to be insulated in our assessment of what's happening out there and try to get as much feedback as possible. So, but thank you everyone for.
So regarding the contractors and regarding the labor unions, I think it's very important too if we can find a way. Not sure we'll ever really get a full seat at the table, but since we're such a large contractor, we have very little leverage with the trade unions, and I'd like to be able to have that. I've had some meetings with the trade union leadership, and they'd be more than willing to do it, so I need to do the same thing with the General Contractors Association as well, because I think it's important that we have somewhat of a seat at the table. If not a full seat, maybe a high seat. But
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's a conversation we've had. And I would again reiterate that there's equal frustration by labor and by the contractors in terms of the tediousness of this process and a desire to try to find a way to streamline it and be more value added and put out a better product. So I think everyone's working on the same team.
Thank you. Commissioner Merdler?
I just have a quick mea culpa. I omitted to mention the work of Norman in terms of all the work he has done on the procurement committee, and I apologize.
Thank you. And thank you, Norman.
Joe.
Larry, Commissioner Schwartz?
I have no mea culpas. I appreciate the work that Veronica and I have done with their committees. In just listening to all the technology changes and improvements, and I'll go online myself to take a look. Are we also making sure that the technology provides assistance to those who are visually impaired or hearing impaired? So, you know, if you can't visually see where your ride is or something like that, you can get some kind of audio, you know, and are we just looking, you know, to try to make sure whether they're stations or technology to make sure that, you know, the rest of the disability community is also getting some kind of relief or assistance there in terms of making their travel easier.
I'm sorry, I neglected to mention that. It's been something I mentioned at all of our working group meetings is the visually impaired, the sight impaired, the cognitively impaired. I think we do want to address that, as I said about the New York City transit system. People who are cognitively fine often get lost in our system. I can't imagine how bad it is. I mentioned about, I think we need better signage. I think that's one of the tasks we're going to take on. As far as the visually impaired, I myself, as a lawyer, have a client who's blind, and I asked her to go and use the JAWS. She has what the program blind people use is called JAWS. It reads websites. It doesn't read us very well at all, and that's not uncommon. It's a lot of websites are not made to be read well by this program, which most blind people use. And I think I asked that we could take a look at that and see how we could, maybe an alternate website even, I don't know. But we do. You're right, we do have to do that because you cannot access most of the information on a website if you're blind. The program that does it doesn't work with it. That's an issue, and I thank you for mentioning that.
And just briefly on the paratransit side, a great partner has been made by the paratransit staff and management with a group called OATS, and I'm going to mess up the acronym, but basically what they do is assist older adults in using technology across a variety of across a wide variety of tools, and they provide a variety of trainings and classes, etc. So the short answer is the team is in a troubleshooting phase right now, but working with this external partner that is experienced beyond measure on how to provide these tools in the most accessible format to a variety of customers and with needs.
There are no further questions or comments. I'd like to, in an interest of time, get right into the rest of the agenda. The minutes of February's meeting have been distributed to all the members. Are there any corrections or omissions? If not, I'll take a motion to approve. I've just gotten it. Do I have a second? All in favor? Say aye. The minutes are approved. Now off to the Committee on Finance, Commissioner Schwartz.
All right, fasten your seatbelts. The Finance Committee met on Monday and reports the following. There's one action item for board approval. The action item requests board approval to authorize the filing with the State of New York, the annual MTA All-Agency Procurement Report for the period of January 1st, 2017 through December 31st, 2017. As required by Section 2879 of the Public Authorities Law, the committee recommends this action item, and I move it.
There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
There are 7 competitive procurements in the amount of $7.7 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
I'll second it. Do I have any questions or comments? There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
There are 10
Procurements carry.
ratifications in the amount of $94.6 million. The committee recommends these ratifications, and I move them.
I'll second it. Are there any questions or comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion's
There are
carried.
5 real estate action items this month described on pages 56 through 66 of the board book, distributed for this meeting. The committee recommends these real estate items, and I move them.
I'll second it. Are there any questions or comments? There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion's carried.
That concludes the Finance Committee report.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Now the report from the Transit Committee from Commissioner Ferrer.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. The Transit and Bus Committee met on Monday and reports the following. There are 3 competitive procurements, one for New York City Transit for $8.7 million and 2 for the MTA Capital Construction for $4.6 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
I'll second them. Are there any questions or comments? There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
There are 2 ratifications to New York City Transit for $8.7 million. The committee recommends these ratifications, and I move them.
I'll second it. Any questions or comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
And that concludes the report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Ferrer. Now off to the Metro North Railroad Committee. Dr. Metzger.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The Metro North Railroad Committee met on Monday, and I report the following. There is one action item this month. It is applicable to both of the MTA commuter railroads, Metro North and Long Island Railroad. The action item requests approval to revise our fare policy to extend the refund period for unused portions of one-way, round-trip, and 10-trip tickets for an additional 2-year period. This is in compliance with a recent amendment to the Public Authorities Law. The committee recommends this action item, and I move it.
I'll second it. Do I have any questions or comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Action carries.
There are 2 non-competitive procurements for $21.5 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
I'll second it. Do I have any questions or comments? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Procurements carry.
There are 2 competitive procurements for $15 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
I'll second it. Any questions or comments? There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This concludes the Metro North Committee report.
Thank you, Dr. Metzger. Now, Commissioner Palley will deliver the report on the Long Island Railroad Committee.
The Long Island Railroad Committee met on Monday, and I report the following. There are 3 competitive procurements for the Long Island Railroad in the amount of $21.5 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
I'll second it. Do we have any questions or comments? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Procurements carry.
There is 1 ratification for the Long Island Railroad in the amount of $9.8 million. The committee recommends this ratification, and I move it.
I'll second it. Any questions, comments? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Ratification carries.
And this concludes the Long Island Railroad report.
Okay, now the Bridges and Tunnels Committee and its report from Commissioner Merdler.
Consistent with the desire to expedite, there is no action required by the board for Bridges and Tunnels this month.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Merdler. Lastly, I chaired the Corporate Governance Committee this month, and we have 5 action items. The first action item is to request the board to approve the MTA's mission statement and authorize submission of the 2017 mission statement, measurements, and performance indicators report to the Independent Authority's Budget Office. The next action item seeks the board approval of the proposed revisions to the MTA bylaws as described in the staff summary provided in the board book. The third action item requests the board approval for the revised MTA committee charters as described in the staff summary. The next item requests the board approval of the MTA's all-agency procurement guidelines and all-agency guidelines for the procurement of services. And the final action item requests the board approval for the revision of certain existing policies of the MTA and its agencies. The committee recommends these items, and I move them.
Second.
Item has been seconded. Questions or comments? Commissioner Vanderpool.
Although I'm not on the governance committee, I did participate in Monday's meeting. And I wanted to share a general comment about governance for this board meeting. The committee meeting on Monday, at the end of the day, was sparsely attended, as it often is. But the issue of governance is so central and critical to our function as the board that I wanted to take a few moments to touch on some issues. I'm going to abstain from this vote, and I'm going to do so because I neither support the changes. I'm not in full agreement with the changes just because I don't think they go far enough. But I don't want to vote against them because there's nothing substantively flawed in the changes that have been provided. I think as a board we have a significant governance issue, and that issue was really created by the state legislature. It is not the result or the outcome of any in particular board chair or any particular governor or any particular assembly person or senator. It is the outcome of decisions that had been made some time ago. I think the problem with this board structure is that power is concentrated in one position. And while this board makes very important decisions, this board's decision and its power tends to be over the fare structure, service cuts, and the approval of the capital program, but not necessarily the composition of it. And we need to leave that to the experts. We're not experts on that. But we do have a governance and a power structure here that is very different and very fundamentally challenging to our role as members of a public authority. There are other transit systems around this country that have very significant different governance models. For example, MTA in San Francisco, they have an entire staff dedicated to their board that they themselves hire and they themselves fund. We don't have that. We as a board do not have resources that are dedicated or exclusive to us. We do have a vast array of qualified and experienced resources in the staff personnel that work at the MTA every single day. But if we have issues that we're unclear about, there's not an independent source. There is an auditor, an inspector general to the MTA, but that person is appointed by the governor. And there's an authority budget office, but the head of that is appointed by the governor. And we have a chair, but that position is appointed by the governor. And the presidents of the agencies are appointed by the chair. It's just a very different governance model than what I see from some other agencies. And I think governance is so important that there has to be a time that we as a full board and not just a committee really dive in to what a different structure might look like and how do we affect that change and how do we respond to a lot of the criticisms that we have received from members of the public and the state legislature also, and of course the media. And I think it is part of our reputation, it's part of our legitimacy as a board, it's part of our credibility. And all of that is so essential, again, to securing new sources of revenue, to working with other partners, to making significant reforms that we've heard at least identified by the chairs of these task forces. So Having said that, I just wanted to explain my abstention from today's vote and then implore my fellow board members to continue to put governance at the forefront, but not just at the forefront of our decisions, but at the forefront of some changes that I think we really need to have over the next year. So when we're talking about bylaws next year, we have something substantive to discuss and maybe some real opportunities at reform. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? So, Veronica, I hear everything you said. For a portion of it, I'd like to be able to work with the board on governance. Governance is not something I think happens once a year when you evaluate it. It's ongoing, it's living, and it's something we need to do. A lot of what you discussed is statutory, and that's a whole different, realm altogether. And so I understand that. But as someone who said earlier in the meeting, this is the way we've always done it before. No, we've got to try a way to change it. Look, I think we have an opportunity as a board to work together a lot better than we have, and I'm doing everything I can to allow that to happen. And if you don't agree with something I've done, I've not discouraged anybody from telling me, both privately and publicly. So I understand that. But when it comes to the statutory side, that's a whole different ball of wax. It becomes a whole different thing. Not saying that we can't attempt a change, but it requires working with the legislative branch and the executive branch. As you know, not something very easily done. Right. Commissioner Reckler?
I just want to, I thought were good comments by Veronica on this, but I also would like to compliment you, Joe, for, I know you had these sessions with us in subgroups just to brainstorm about how we can have better governance, better communication, and be more effective as a board, and we're very open-minded to a lot of that discourse. So I think it sort of complements a lot of what Veronica was making the point about in terms of functioning as an effective board, take into account your legislative comments. But thank you for doing that, and just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. And it's not something that I think I want to do once. The meetings that we had, the lunches that we had, I thought were helpful, and I'd like to be able to continue to do them on a more frequent basis. Okay. Before we adjourn, well, we didn't vote. I'm sorry. All in favor, say aye. Those opposed? Those abstaining? Thank you. The actions carry. Before we adjourn, I just want to ask, as I said, I would promise at each one of those lunches, is there any new business? Is there anything else that we need to discuss as a board before we adjourn? Commissioner Reckler?
So at the last meeting, I asked for the opportunity to have the Fix NYC report presented to the board for discourse and potentially having a vote on the key principles related to that report. And first, I'd like to thank the chairman for setting that up and thank my fellow board members for participating in those meetings. And I thought the thoughtful discourse around the Fix NYC plan, as we noted, and I noted, I think, going into those meetings, the Fix NYC plan really is meant to be a framework around principles that ultimately the people in Albany will legislate and put out around. And I think that in that discourse that we had, I think there was general agreement around the key principles. I think there was question as to whether we as a board should be voting on that, what role we should be playing. I would just say, from my standpoint, as I listen to the challenges that we face, and from our reports in the committee, from the continued challenges we're facing with our subway, and I know we have the subway action plan, but that's just to help us get through the disrepair, not really bring it to we have a 21st century subway, and we heard a lot of this from Andy Byford on that, to our bus system woefully losing more and more customers because of the congestion on the streets in New York, and needing to be able to solve that problem to make our bus system work. And then obviously our financial woes that we have, and we've had Bob, our CFO, share with us the forecast that by 2020 we'll have over $400 million of a deficit, assuming we even have fare increases, I believe in that number. Mm-hmm. And so it's a major, we have major challenges in front of us as a board. And what I would say is if you think of what's out there, the only proposal that's out there right now, the only real proposal that deals with the congestion on our streets and thus the effectiveness of our our bus system and creating a dedicated incremental source of revenue for this agency to continue to thrive is the congestion pricing plan that was put forward by Fix NYC. The basic principles, again, I think can be taken in different ways when you have any committee put things in place. There's lots of ideas. I'd ask the board members who hadn't seen it, Commissioner Weisbrod and myself co-wrote an op-ed that was in the Daily News today supporting some congestion pricing principles that I think tried to even take into account some of the feedback that at least I had heard and he had heard in the sessions that we had as a board to have some consensus around this. While we're not taking a vote on this today, what I would say, and going back to Veronica's point about what do we do as a board, I think as a board we also have a responsibility to advocate, right? I think we have a responsibility to recognize the challenges that we are seeing as an agency and for us to be successful and advocate to the stakeholders, the elected officials that ultimately have to move forward with this and let them understand the sense of urgency that exists here, that if we don't take some action, we're going to be looking in the rearview mirror as we have financial challenges, subway challenges, bus challenges, and system failure. And the more that we're vocal about it, I think the more they're going to listen, because they're not really listening today. There really doesn't appear to be that same sense of urgency based on what has been proposed so far in this budget. And we all have different relationships, and I would encourage us all to use our relationships and any moments that we have to speak publicly about the challenges, about this being a solution in some form to addressing those challenges. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Commissioner Trottenberg.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I want to compliment Scott and Carl. I certainly saw the op-ed, and I think a lot in there was terrific. And, some of the ideas that they mentioned in the op-ed that came from the Fix NYC panel, congestion pricing, which I think some of you know, Mayor had expressed some skepticism and has now expressed some openness. FHV fees, which I think is in the Assembly's budget proposal, and we think is a particularly good idea because it's something that could be implemented pretty quickly and produce, obviously, the revenue that this agency needs, better camera enforcement authority for the city, looking at placards, which, by the way, placards is not just a city issue. States, feds, there are all kinds of entities, including this very agency, that issue placards. So certainly something that we could all look at in terms of congestion reduction. And I want to particularly acknowledge and thank you all in the op-ed for saying you actually think the city should have an equal say in some of these decisions. I have to say that is in notable contrast to the Fix NYC panel, which had, I don't know now whether it had 15 or 16 members, because it appears perhaps the mayor of Yonkers was not on at the end. As we all know, the city was not at all involved in the panel. And there was only one woman on the panel, which kind of a little bit echoes what happens here on the board, where there are only 3 women. So I have to put my voice up for perhaps getting a diverser set of voices on all these different panels. But I do want to compliment you. I think the op-ed made some important points, and I agree, conveyed a sense of urgency. I want to say, I think from the city's point of view, we feel a little urgency, though, about some of the proposals that we do understand are being circulated up in Albany, which were not really so much part of the Fix NYC panel's recommendations. It's time for breakfast. 2 in particular that I want to highlight that I think we have pretty big concerns about, and I don't think these are any secret. One in particular, the value capture proposal. I have seen language that has versions of it which are astonishingly expansive, which would potentially confiscate city real estate taxes for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years into the hundreds of billions, would require the city, for example, to pay for all of Penn Station, Metro North, East Side access. Obviously, we view that as a pretty radical rating of city property taxes, which I think many of you have heard the mayor say we need in the city for police, for firefighters, for schools, for hospitals, for the roads and bridges that some of you often talk to me about. So, just want to express there, I think there are some areas we can really work together, but I think the value capture provision and the city and the MTA have done value capture together, as we all know. Hudson Yards, Atlantic Yards, we've done a version of it at 1 Vanderbilt, and now with the new East Midtown rezoning, but we don't think this is something that should be legislated, and I think the proposals we're hearing about are pretty radical. Likewise, I think another very important piece of the puzzle, whether we're doing FHV fees or ultimately moving into a bigger congestion pricing version, and I agree with Commissioner Reckler. I'm not quite sure that's getting urgent attention as it should. The issue of how that's managed on our streets. And, I've also sort of heard and seen that there's language floating around that essentially would take all the ability to operate and manage all the traffic and all the traffic infrastructure on Manhattan streets and give it to the MTA. And I have to say, as the DOT commissioner for the city of New York, I have grave concerns about that. Putting myself aside, I have a team of traffic engineers and planners and experts who've been running the city streets of New York for decades. I think they do an extraordinary job. We have one of the most complicated traffic systems in the world. And as we've managed that system, we've also managed to continue to drive fatalities down. I have to credit my incredible team for that. And I can't see how a proposal that essentially completely leaves the city out of that particular infrastructure, which would allow the MTA, as far as the language I'm sort of hearing is floating around, to install any kind of devices anywhere they want, use eminent domain, not consult with the city in any way. Just want to express deep concerns about that type of a proposal and hope, again, as you all proposed in your op-ed, this could be something where the city and state would have a partnership. So thank you.
Dean Foolahan, I'll check with him in a second, but Polly, I agree with you on the last comments that you made about your deep concern. It would be my deep concern as well.
I'm glad you would say that, Joe, because I honestly do think, that is something where our agency really does have the expertise and, an area where we would want to work together, but just to be completely left out of the picture, I think would be a terrible mistake.
Yeah, I've not seen that language that you're talking about, so can you call Dean and tell him to stop?
I'll just also add, I haven't heard anything about that language that you're speaking about, but at least from the feedback from when fixing the NYC was to actually provide the city with more tools in terms of the cameras for enforcement, recognizing the challenges, as you noted, in terms of the police.
No, and we greatly appreciate that. I mean, this has come up in this discussion so many times, particularly regarding bus speeds, and it's been nice to have President Byford here to bring the London perspective. Big cities like London are using automated enforcement, and, they have a fair amount of autonomy in being able to do that.
Mr. Merdler?
I will be very brief. Congestion occurs in major part when the municipality makes a value judgment to constrain traffic. That's the cause, a cause. Another cause is when you have almost as many Ubers, Goobers, and the like running around as you have vehicles that are driven by the public. Those are issues that you have to consider. And just to gloss over those, as I do not suggest you do, Commissioner Trottenberg, but as I suggest others do, is wrong.
I think we're in strong agreement on certainly the rise of the Ubers and the FHVs, and Bruce Schaller and others have done really great research on that. So 100%, I think that's an area where the legislature can move quickly, and it's something that the city and the state together can implement pretty quickly and really raise revenue for this agency and have some noticeable effects on congestion.
Commissioner Albert?
Because there has been such a lot of discussion and an important discussion on the issue of congestion pricing, and because several members of the board have been out front in advocating for it, I'm just wondering, in as much as this issue is before the legislature now, when would be the right time for the board to take a position? Wouldn't it be now?
I don't think there's a proposal on the table. There's a theory, there's a framework on the table. But I think at some point, I think there's general consensus amongst the board from the discussions we had that something needs to be done to provide the MTA with a stream of revenue. Something needs to be done regarding congestion. This is a unique opportunity. But I do think that one of the unique things about the Fix NYC report is that it was in 3 tranches, 3 different approaches. And I think we need to embark on the next level of approach, which is community hearings and community involvement and other elected official involvement. We're at the very beginning stages of it. And so there will be a time and a place, but I think we all are concerned about, for those of us who live in this city, about the congestion, for those of us who visit the city, about the congestion, and then the concern about our revenue.
And one of the things that I have noticed about this discussion is that in the Fix NYC proposal, as opposed to the original Move New York proposal, there weren't tolls on the bridges which facilitates bridge shopping, as Sam Schwartz likes to say. This, the other thing that was in the original one that is not in this one was a reduction in the tolls of the crossings that do not feed the congestion zone, which would have been a selling point to Brooklyn and Queens politicians, which is not in the current proposal, which the governor has advocated for. Well, sure, yeah. And the other thing that seems to be, well, sure, but the thing that's, well, the Verrazano was one of those crossings, obviously. So the other thing is that we haven't yet, or nobody seems to have spelled out to the residents and elected officials of Brooklyn and Queens what transit improvements were in the offing should this thing pass. And I think that's a big omission.
View it necessarily as an omission, but that it's the next step in the process. I mean, there are advocates, yesterday and today who are saying that they need to have a vote on congestion pricing now, that it's the answer to all the problems at the MTA. Quite honestly, it's a complicated process, and it's one that needs to be done in a methodical basis. And I do think it requires the involvement of the communities and involvement of elected officials. That's the next step.
And just again, as Chairman Loda said, it was the concept of the phases, and was to be able to establish and solve some of those and work with the committee on providing some of those answers, but at the same time accelerating areas where we can drive revenue more quickly, like the for-hire vehicles and other things of that nature, while planning for the broader congestion pricing.
Commissioner Paley?
As a longtime supporter of congestion pricing from the suburbs, I want to congratulate Commissioner Reckler and Commissioner Weisbrod on the article. I think I would agree the Fix New York proposal is a start. It is not a finish. There are lots of things in there that I think can be changed, including the bridge issue, which I made clear at the briefings, and others. But I think the time has come in this state to have a congestion pricing application. How we do it and what included, I think, are different things. But I wanted to make it clear from my perspective out in Suffolk County that congestion pricing is essential for the MTA in large part because it can change people's nature of what they do and what they hopefully can continue to do. Second thing, I want to agree with Polly on the issue of the state-city relationship. If that was something that was happening on Long Island, we'd be yelling, and I have no doubts she should be yelling in this context, and I would hope that the state and city could do this collectively and cooperatively. It is too important an issue to be left to one side or the other side, and only by doing it together, because congestion pricing, the pricing part by itself will not solve the congestion issues in New York City, nor will just bus cameras. It has to be a combination of a variety of things together, and I would hope that both groups could do that. The third issue, which I have continued to harp on and have been harping on for the last 6 months and will continue to do that, is these issues also have to take into account the operating plan of the MTA. We cannot, in my opinion, increase our fares next December at this time. We cannot do it. We may be forced to do it, but we shouldn't do it. And until the legislature and the governor include operating assistance as part of these discussions on congestion pricing or other issues, I think we're only talking about part of the issue. Because in these times of difficulties on the system, and we don't have to elaborate on what those are, to ask our riders to pay more now, in my opinion, would be a grievous mistake. It's March. We have time till December to solve that problem in some way, hopefully with our funding partners, but to continue to disregard that issue and come to November when the CFO puts out a budget and there it is again, and nobody thought about it, I think is much too late. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Had there been a resolution in support of congestion pricing proposed today, I would have voted in favor of it. But much like the chairman said, there will be other opportunities for us to weigh in on that. At the very least, much like Scott has said, at the very least, I think it's important to affirm some basic principles about congestion pricing. And I want to thank you, Scott, for making it broad about congestion pricing and not about fixed NYC, because quite frankly, while I'm glad that there's a proposal on the table initiated by the governor, not included in the governor's budget or in the amendments or the resolutions, but put forth as a starting point, I think it was important to not get hemmed up in the details of any particular plan, and there's a few proposals on the table, but to talk about the importance of congestion pricing broadly. And one way that the MTA can assert itself in the conversation is, as Scott said, to affirm some basic principles. A lockbox is needed. In 2011 and 2013, when the state legislature unanimously approved lockbox legislation, the MTA was largely, well, not largely silent, but not largely supportive of the effort to get that money lockbox for the agency. And I think, just asserting it's the agency's support for new revenue sources, much as it is front and center in advocating for value capture. So I just want to transition briefly to that. I am also concerned about the idea for value capture. I've noted that there has been a good deal of support from the executive chamber, the second floor, and the MTA as an agency for that, the proposal that has been put forth. We've discussed this a good deal. There's a lot of support for value capture. I think the proposal that's put forth is not being applied very fairly. There's two things that bother me. The language that says any revenue from this transportation improvement district may be applied to the MTA. That word may is problematic. There's no reason we should support such ambiguous and gray language. May should not even be in the proposal. And then secondly, I think that secondly, the fact that this proposal applies just to New York City, I think, is not a balanced approach. We understand the limitations of the suburbs and strong local zoning laws and home rule, but that does not mean that the city should be the victim of this imbalanced application. I think that is a flawed premise. Again, value capture is important. Many of us support it, but I think it's unilateral application for New York City and not with more consideration or at least language to further be worked out for the rest of the MTA territory as an opening salvo is incredibly short-sighted.
I even have to go a step further than my colleague. I don't think this is a matter that should be legislated. I think, and furthermore, I fear that I hear up in Albany, it's sort of becoming the diversion, the smokescreen, the problem, the solution in search of a problem, instead of tackling what I think are the real urgent ways that this agency needs to raise revenue. I think, a plan that is, again, the broadest reading of it essentially takes half of Manhattan and confiscates 3/4 of its property taxes for the next 35 to 70 years, I think that's not the right way to go. I think we have some much more pragmatic ideas. The panel mentioned them. Obviously, they're being debated, and I would hope we could sort of put what I think is a distraction, and Veronica's point is well taken. Certainly not fair that it applies only to the city. And furthermore, appears to make the city pay for projects that largely benefit the commuter rails, in addition to all the subway projects, and move on to work on some of the things where we don't have total consensus, but I think we have a lot of people who want to see them happen.
There being no further, sorry.
On just briefly on the value capture thing, I just find it ironic. It's though as I read it and as it's written, it seems to create this agency as a super agency where we have power to tax. I think that's terribly inappropriate.
No legislation. I've listened to all of it, everything, and I understand everything it said, but that statement is absolutely wrong. The MTA does not have the power to tax, nor is there any legislation put forward that gives it.
Okay, but
it has the power to confiscate, not to tax. It can confiscate the city's taxes once the city levies taxes.
It can create districts and collect and impose.
Confiscate.
And impose. Well, that's. which changes the tax system, and it would change what people pay essentially. So I differ on that. But anyway, it does do something for the MTA, which many people have talked about, is that it does really create a lockbox, and it does create a complete dedicated fund. I think it's a bad idea as a city resident. I don't like it, but that's what it does. And if something, and the question is, do you want to create something like that where you do actually create some kind of dedicated real estate taxes? We already have some, but if you want to look at that as a model for the MTA, but I think the legislature has to vote on it, and possibly even the city council would probably be a better way to deal with the situation, because I think the city council has to be involved anytime you talk about property taxes. But that's how I read that bill.
Thank you. Commissioner Brown.
Yeah. First of all, without voting on something, you've got the sense from everybody here they're all in favor of congestion pricing. So we didn't hold a vote, but I didn't hear a bad word spoken about congestion pricing, and I'm certainly not going to speak a bad word about it. Value capture, on the other hand, is still too amorphous a concept to speak badly or well about. And people, you kind of want to color it whatever color you want to color it. But the character of what Polly's talking about, and I think she's proper in her way she characterizes it as confiscation, to the extent the MTA creates a very dispersed value throughout the New York economy. It's not in any single location that value is created. And the city does benefit from suburban commuter rail projects, though, you wouldn't know it from a lot of the conversation I hear from city representatives, but it's valuable for both parties. You have a station you get on your train at, and there's a station you get off your train at, and both of them are valuable to you. And they all have value. The entire system has value to everybody because everybody can access it. But when you use your value capture on a specific location, on a specific piece of property, the economic force is all extracted from that property. So that when you had even the TIF in West Side Yard or Hudson Yards, whatever you call it, to the extent that the expense of that was paid for by that single property was really, in a way, the rest of us exploited that. The rest of us who didn't pay those taxes still get to travel to that location, and that's the way the nature of the system is. And the broader you base a value capture model, the less you will have to take from each unit, to where it will be less painful for each unit. So I think a lot of what I read, and I try to, you try to read that legislation and figure out what the hell they were talking about when they did that. It seemed like what they're trying to do is figure out a way to fund the rest of the Second Avenue subway. That's what I was reading in that particular paragraph of, obviously being a union representative instead of a lawyer, I'm at a disadvantage in reading that legislation. But the values that are created by a capital investment in the MTA are dispersed through the entire region. And to the extent you can capture the value from the entire region, it's not going to be that onerous a thing. It can be very much like the water district. You don't really hear people, of course, when water rates go up, people complain about their water rates. But in many ways, it's similar to providing water for New York City. I've spoken too much, but that's my...
Any further comments? Commissioner Metzger.
Like Mitch, I have been a long-term supporter of congestion pricing. Nevertheless, I have opposed having this board take a vote on that. And my reason has been that too often when we get into the discussion as to exactly what we mean, we get into other specifics as well. And I fear that we lose track, or the public, or maybe the legislature, loses track of the one thing that I know this board has complete consensus on, and that is we need a dedicated source of money. And in past years, long past, it wasn't unusual for the board as a unit to go to Albany and say, we need money. And I still think it was suggested previously that perhaps the board should be a better advocate. I'm more than willing to advocate for that because the bottom line here is that we need money in order to keep our subways and our commuter rail and our bridges and tunnels up to the state of good repair that needs to happen. So that's it for me.
Any further comments? Thank you for all coming out today. Our next meeting is April 25th. I'll look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. For a motion to adjourn. Thank you. Good morning. 5 more minutes. The first since I've been here. Before I start, I do want to follow up with how I started the formal part of the meeting this morning with a silence regarding one of our workers who passed away yesterday, who died on the job, St. Clair, Zaire Richard Stevens. I can't overemphasize enough the amount of work and the amount of strenuous work that all of our transit workers do day in and day out. And as Tony Utano, the president of the union, said, while we sleep at night, thousands of transit workers are down in the system, making sure it's repaired and getting into a better and better state of reliability. So, as I said earlier, I'm, very sorry this happened, and also have great sympathies towards the family and friends, as well as all of the co-workers of St. Clair. Questions? Mr. Rivoli.
Since you brought it up, I would like to ask, can you go through the process of what determining the benefits for the fallen track worker, St. Clair, his family will get, and what is the process for someone who's been on the job as he was?
I don't know the answer to your question. I will have to get back to you. I honestly have no idea. I'll just, right.
Follow up.
Sure.
Pricing, you hear from the board members they don't want to move forward with another fare hike. Is that what's your position on actually going through with the fare hike this year, absent any congestion pricing or stable revenue source?
There is no congestion pricing this year. There is one next year, and I have talked about how important it is to be able to maintain balance in our budget, and that if there's, there are scenarios, but there are very few of them available that we would not. But I do think that the agreement that was made between in 2009 between the governor at the time, the majority leader, and the speaker, as well as it was when I was up in Albany last week, it was restated to me that there's been an agreement that there would be a fare and toll increase every other year. And I don't see any change in that at the present time.
As long as the law says that?
The law doesn't say that. The law doesn't say that. There's an agreement that says that, but our financial plan has, ever since then, included a fare and toll increase every other year.
So is there a scenario you can commit to where you would support not increasing the fares for 2019?
At the present time, no. Hey, Dana, how was your trip in?
It was okay.
Good.
How was yours?
Get a seat?
Yes. So I understand you recently said at an independent neighborhood Democratic meeting that there's unlikely to be a congestion pricing bill this year. Is that, in fact, your understanding?
Sure. I've said it publicly over and over again. I'm sorry you missed it. You didn't have to go to the independent Democratic committee meeting to hear that. I said it at the board meeting today. I said it, essentially said it today. I've said it in the past, too. I think the Fix NYC proposal was a combination of done in 3 phases, and the first phase did not include until 3 phases for the full implementation of congestion pricing, and there was no expectation of there being any legislation this year regarding congestion pricing.
Okay.
So with great ease, I said that and say that.
Thank you. And then secondly, what are your thoughts on this value capture proposal that's
I've been a big proponent of value capture ever since I was an investment banker, having done TIF financings, tax increment financings, all throughout the country, Florida and California in particular. I think it is an extraordinarily valuable way to be able to finance transit projects as well as other types of projects. So I'm in full support of implementing some form of value capture.
What about this particular proposal?
There are numerous proposals that are out there. There are negotiations, some of which actually even happened this morning between the city and the state and the MTA, and so it's evolving.
Hi, Chairman.
Ponce, how are you? I can hear you.
I'm good. A couple questions trying to squeeze in here. First, regarding today's storm,
yes.
Given some of the struggles that the Long Island Railroad's had, do you have any particular concerns? Maybe in the context of that, you could talk about what more we know now about the performance improvement plan.
So the concerns that I always have for both commuter railroads is concerns when the wind picks up at a certain high speed and trees and or utility poles come down onto the tracks. That causes the most amount of damage. We have the ability, given the reasonable amount of snow that we're seeing right now, to continue to keep the tracks clear and be running. The railroad was generally on time, the Long Island Railroad, this morning on the way in. I fully expect that to continue throughout the day, but we have to keep evaluating it. As you know, we get upwards of 10 inches of snow in any part of the Long Island Railroad area. You'll see sporadic suspensions so that we can clean the tracks. But so far, so good. And I think that this storm is going to be one that's going to be stretched out over a long period of time, which will also give us an opportunity to get as much done as possible to keep up and running. The performance improvement plan, I understand every component of the performance improvement plan. I think it is comprehensive. We are in the process of funding it, finding funding for it from within the Long Island Railroad. I think that, each one of the operating units here has some form of a performance improvement plan or an action plan or whatever. We keep changing terminology. But essentially, what is it that we need to do to get the system into a greater state of reliability? I think the problems that the Long Island Railroad had in January in particular were ones that, quite honestly, I personally believe that, staff will hate this, but they were self-inflicted, and they will never happen again.
And then, unrelated, word came out last week about the bar carts going away at Penn Station platforms. I know that's something that Mitch Pally has been pushing for a long time. He finally gets it. But there are a lot of commuters who are not going to be happy to hear about that. For them, it's a premium service for the premium prices they pay. So,
the prices to buy a drink, a mixed drink, or a beer are no more expensive upstairs. That's a connection I'm not sure I'm making, but that's okay. We're not. I'm doing everything we can. The private sector has the ability to sell all the products that were there, the fact that they're not being sold directly before they get into the door of the train. I mean, we're not telling them they can't drink on the train. They can, with the exception of certain days of the year. They up at Penn Station and at other locations, there are ability to buy drinks, and I encourage them to if they want to have one, buy one, and buy one at one of the stores upstairs.
Hi, Chairman. I just want to ask you a question in relation to the worker's death yesterday. I know there's an investigation ongoing, but obviously you have workers out there every day. Are you going to get rid of the wooden railings that are there? And why were there wooden railings at this point in time in a place where someone would have to lean against that? And what sort of immediate steps will you take to keep workers safe?
So the railings, as you brought up, is a question that I had that is also a significant part of that investigation. Andy, do you want to go over? But I do think it's let Andy go through it and I'll follow up.
Okay, so I will. And
Dan, I'll just comment on one other thing. We have assigned, we need to get back to you to the question you asked the chair, but I met with the family yesterday at the medical centre. That was a high priority for me, and we have already assigned a one-stop shop, a single person who will coordinate all of the various paperwork and benefits and return of personal effects for that family, because the one thing I do not want is that family encountering NYCT bureaucracy. We're making sure that they're given a single point of contact. And I've also given Mrs. Richards my card, and I've said if you get any problems at all, you call me day and night. So to your question, the location in question had wooden railings. There were two railings, one about waist height and one a bit lower, that were protecting this drop against from the higher to the lower level, or ostensibly there to do that. For whatever reason, yet to be established, the rail did not manage to restrain our member of staff when it appears that he leaned on that. So that section has already been replaced overnight there, and at a number of other locations we've put in perspex, much tougher perspex railings. They've gone in at that location and along that stretch of line. I've asked for my team to now survey the rest of the system to see where there are other potentials for drops, and again we will be looking to check the prevailing conditions of any railings that are there, and if necessary to replace them with more robust railing. But I would stress, though, that is a precaution at the moment. We have not yet had the full investigation, as I'm sure you'll understand, to establish exactly what happened. That at the moment is in response to what we think happened. We think Sinclair leaned on the railing and it gave way.
Chairman, to sort of follow up with one of Dan's questions, S&P lowered the bond rating for the MTA recently. That was followed by a Moody's report kind of painting a grim picture of the MTA finances in the chance of an oncoming recession. Do you think even if with the fare increases, if you go ahead with them as planned in 2019, that's enough of a safeguard, given all the speculation and questions with congestion pricing in Albany, to kind of avoid unplanned fare hikes or service cuts?
Your question is a very good one, but let's play off of what Moody's wrote. What Moody's talked about is that in a deep recession. So the last time we had a very deep recession, 2008, 2009, if you talked to me in 2007 or anybody who was at this podium at that time in 2007, would they have expected a recession as deep and as far as what happened in 2008 and 2009, which then caused radical decisions to need to be made at the MTA? I don't expect a recession like that. I don't think anybody does, but we will be prepared to deal with it if it happens. But to speculate that it's going to happen, it would just engender fear into people, and I don't think that's necessary. But good management requires that we be prepared to react quickly and swiftly in the event that there is any kind of an economic downturn. There hasn't been one in quite some time. In fact, things have been pretty constant. But I do think, as Moody's wrote, be prepared. And we are. Jose, how are you?
Morning or good afternoon?
9 minutes into it, yeah.
Follow up on what Alfonso asked, but to put it within the lens of the city, are there any plans at this point to limit service in the subway beyond the usual storing of trains on express tracks?
At this time, there is none other than the storage on express tracks. We'll monitor the snow as it continues on to be able to determine, for that portion of our subway system that is not beneath the ground but above ground, we need to make sure that all of those are cleared in parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and in the Bronx, actually Manhattan as well, somewhat. But at this point in time, things are coming down in a pace that's been reasonable for all of our operating agencies to be able to deal with the snow. But as I encouraged everybody earlier today, continue to watch MTA.info, www.mta.info, and we will be keeping the press involved if there are any changes. But at this point in time, not expected. Thank you all.